Hey, and welcome to the last short lecture from Chapter 11. And today we've already talked about all the different approaches that have been developed over, say, the past 100 years for thinking of leadership. And today we're going to talk about the current critical communication perspective. So how, based on all this that we've learned and experimented with through the past, how do we see it now? So now, if we're talking about a critical communication perspective, we could say the critical communication rejects the separation of leader and follower, and instead thinks of leadership as a transactional process it's co-produced between followers and leaders. You need both for this critical communication perspective. Also, we see that there's no essence of leadership. There's nothing. There's nothing. Leaders aren't born, right? Leaders are made, and indeed, leaders are made or constructed in specific organizational contexts. Now, communication, our ability to symbolically, communicate with one another, is key in understanding how this leadership is made, how it's constructed. Again, there's no great man approach. Leadership is distributed through the organization. So leadership isn't just about the guy or girl that's the leader. It's about everyone who makes that leadership possible, and that from the lowest worker on the totem pole through that highest worker. And so this view challenges traditional research, and it focuses more on questions of power and control. Who has it? How is it exercised? Etc. Now, it also recognizes that leaders and executives are subject, just like their employees are, to forms of disciplinary power in which they're constantly being assessed in terms of their ability to lead and produce. Your book discusses how they're subject to what we call 360-degree assessments, including self-assessments. And so this is something that you see quite a bit in the modern workplace, the self-assessment. Now, I have to admit to personally thinking that this is a weird thing. I don't understand why anyone would do a self-assessment and give themselves bad ratings, regardless of their performance. But then again, I've been accused of lacking in having a moral compass, and so perhaps this explains it. But there is quite a bit of self-assessment. That's a popular thing to do. It's something, by the way, all of your professors do at Gordon State. And so people who are in leadership positions are subject to these kinds of disciplinary controls. Having someone critique themselves is very much a form of disciplinary control, and I suggest to you it's a deeply unethical one. But that's my opinion. And so the role of the leader has been constructed differently, and we recognize this over different times. So critical Comm looks at this and says, listen, leaders are not always the same. Leaders change according to context. Our ideas of leadership change over time. What makes a good leader? What constitutes good leadership? And today we recognize that the leaders looked at as valuable intellectual capital. That today leaders are really enjoying a position in society where they're highly, highly valued, and that conversely employees are expendable. And we see this all the time through things like downsizing, offshoring, all the things that lead to cost-saving measures. So you have, particularly in the United States, CEOs that are earning hundreds, if not thousands of times what their lowest paid employee is earning. And in some cases, these folks earn hundreds of millions of dollars. And I suggest to you that no one person is worth hundreds of millions of dollars to an organization. They're simply not. But we live in a culture today where they've been afforded this opportunity, and this will change over time, no doubt. Now, another thing that we haven't really talked about is what your book and scholars like Zoller and Fairhurst have categorized as resistance leadership. And this is an interesting way of thinking about leadership, where they look at it as a political act, and specifically they look at as resistance leadership as political acts that benefit the community. And so in these situations, leadership really isn't about the person in charge, but about the way one or more of these people engages the community. And it's more as in social action. So this kind of leadership challenges conventional assumptions and existing power relations. And so an example of a resistant leader might be a whistleblower, someone in a organization that comes out and says, listen, you're doing bad things, and I'm going to let people know about it because this is harming the community. Now, clearly that's a form of leadership, but it's not one that necessarily has the best interest of, well, I mean, it isn't a question of not necessarily, it's a form of leadership that doesn't have the best interest of the organization at heart, but rather the community. Now, another form of leadership that I think is interesting is what we call narrative leadership. And this is based on the idea that I have tried to expand on throughout all of my classes. And that is that human beings tend to understand reality in terms of stories. We think of our lives as stories. We say things to people like, hey, what's your story? Even math is a story, right? According to the Greeks, a story is a pretty simple kind of device. It has three parts. It has a beginning, middle, and end, right? And if we think about it in terms of that three-act structure, we can understand that even math is a narrative. Even math is a story, right? 1 + 1 = 2. It has a beginning, a middle, an end. It meets all the requirements of the classical story. So narrative leadership looks to these stories and says, listen, you don't even really need to think about leadership in terms of people, but think about it in terms of communication and how people communicate. And they say these stories that we tell each other, these things exhibit all the functions that we attribute to people in terms of leadership. Indeed, leaders come and go, but if you've got a good story about your organization, then that can last the life of the company. It can last forever. So when you think about some organizations, particularly ones with long histories, so the military, very interested in military history and the narratives that form their identity. And these stories do as much of the leadership as much as any of the people do, right? When you think about what it means to be a Marine, for example, well, I mean, that's all based on narrative, on story. And I suggest to you that people sign up for the Marines instead of the Army, the Navy, what have you, because of this story. And it's perhaps even more instrumental on their understanding of themselves as Marines than anything a drill instructor said or a commanding officer said. So to me, I find that compelling because I like stories. Now, of course, we should talk about gender and leadership. Gender is something that we've touched on briefly in most of the chapters. And so there's been research into this, and Rosner says, for example, in the discussion of interactive leadership, that a woman's leadership style is oftentimes different than the leadership style of men. Indeed, she says that women tend to emphasize nurturing, support, cooperation, and are more interested in sharing power than men are. Now, in terms of narratives surrounding women leadership in the workplace, we have Fletcher, who posits that women are post-heroic leaders who oftentimes get their accomplishments overlooked. And then there's also this idea of the glass cliff. We've talked about the glass ceiling, how women reach certain levels in organizations and can't go forward even though there's no formal rules preventing them from doing so. The glass cliff it focuses on the idea that when women are appointed as CEOs of organizations, it's oftentimes when those organizations are already in trouble. And so then what happens is, of course, they're faced with a greater risk of failure. An organization that's had a series of rough quarters or rough years will look to shake things up. And so one of the ways they do that sometimes is they say, okay, well, let's bring in a fresh perspective. Let's get a woman CEO in here. And the company's already going down the tubes, right? And so, of course, the woman's not faced with all the traditional problems that face a CEO, but is also faced with an organization that's already begun its decline. And so there's a greater risk of failure. And the organization and that position are already associated with poor performance. So clearly this creates a situation known as the glass cliff, where leadership is more challenging from this perspective, right? Okay, well, that's it for leadership, and I believe this is the last short lecture that we're going to have for this semester. So thank you for bearing with me, and I hope you learned something.